A gravelly, harsh voice echoed across the stillness of Section 60 at Arlington National Cemetery. "Get your hands off me," the voice cracked, reverberating like thunder across the solemn rows of white tombstones. Sergeant Major Bob Weston stood in front of a fresh grave, one hand trembling as he clutched a folded flag and a single white rose. The name etched on the stone was Corporal Daniel Weston, Kia, Kabul, 2023. It was Memorial Day. Bob had been to this very spot every year since the day his son was brought home in a flag-draped casket. Yet today, something felt off. A pair of private security contractors, hired to manage the area for a high-profile dignitary's visit, had approached him too closely. "Sir, this area is temporarily restricted. You'll need to move," one of them said, barely meeting Bob's gaze. He didn't flinch. "You move," Bob growled, his voice low and menacing. "This is my son's grave." The security contractors exchanged uncomfortable glances. One took a half-step back. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Bob's eyes locked on the stone in front of him. The memories of his son flooded back, but his face remained stoic. The flag in his hand felt heavier than usual, as if it bore the weight of years of unresolved grief. His heart thudded in his chest. Daniel had been everything to him, everything he'd fought for, everything he was proud of. And yet, it felt like the world had forgotten him, forgotten his sacrifice. Forgotten the sacrifice of so many others who had given their lives for a country that no longer cared. The contractors took another step forward, and Bob's fists clenched. He would not be moved. He had earned this moment, this sacred space. "This is a sacred place," Bob said, his voice now laced with a quiet fury. "You don't get to tell me what to do here." The tension was palpable as the contractors looked at each other, unsure of how to handle a man who carried the weight of war in his bones, a man whose every scar told a story of battles fought and sacrifices made. They had no idea what it meant to be a Gold Star father. Bob's mind flashed back to that day, the phone call, the knock on the door, the flag folded and handed over with condolences, empty words that didn't fill the hole left by his son's death. He had become a man shaped by loss, his identity now etched in stone alongside his boy's name. "Sir, we're just doing our job," one of the contractors stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. Bob's eyes never left the gravestone. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "This is my job." Bob Weston had been a different man once. A soldier forged in the harsh fires of war, he had worn his uniform with pride, carrying the weight of his duties like a mantle. As a proud member of the 82nd Airborne, he had earned his reputation not through glory, but through sheer grit and determination. His comrades had respected him, not because of his rank, but because he had been the kind of soldier who bled beside them, never asking for anything in return. He had survived battles that took others, men who had become brothers to him. He had seen friends fall in combat and had pulled some back from the brink of death. Yet, nothing compared to the loss of his son, Daniel. Daniel had followed in Bob's footsteps, enlisting in the army straight out of high school. The old man had wanted better for his son, but Daniel had insisted. "I've got to do this, Dad," he'd said, his voice filled with that same sense of duty Bob had known all too well. Daniel had the same fire in his eyes, the same hunger for service and sacrifice. The two of them had often talked about the wars they'd fought, the missions they'd undertaken, but Bob never imagined that one day, he would be standing at his son's grave, clutching a folded flag for the same reasons. It had been a routine mission. A convoy was making its way through a volatile district of Kabul when a bomb detonated just as Daniel's unit had passed. The explosion shattered the peaceful humdrum of the day, turning it into something brutal. It wasn't the kind of ambush they were trained to expect, but it was the kind of attack that could happen at any time. Daniel, like so many others, had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And before Bob had even heard the news, Daniel had been gone. The days that followed had been a blur of paperwork, briefings, and hollow condolences. He had taken the news like a soldier, stiff upper lip, firm handshake, and then, alone in the quiet of his office, he had let the tears come. His son, the one he had raised, the one who had wanted to make a difference, was gone. It felt unreal, like the universe had betrayed him, had stolen a piece of his soul. Bob had to break the news to his wife, Sarah. The phone call was the hardest thing he had ever done. Her scream still haunted him, the sound of a mother losing her child, something so raw, so visceral, that it felt like it tore through the very fabric of the universe. There was no coming back from that, no healing from such a wound. They were both shattered, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The funeral had been a blur of faces, a blur of the flag-draped casket lowered into the ground. A final salute, the tears of strangers, and then the long, empty road home. Bob had tried to hold it together for Sarah, but inside, something had cracked. His identity, his sense of self, had always been intertwined with the military, with service to his country. And now, that country had taken his son. The guilt gnawed at him, and the anger, silent, festering, uncontrollable, grew deeper with each passing day. The flag in his hands now, that same flag that had been draped over Daniel's coffin, was a bitter reminder of that sacrifice. Every fold, every stitch, seemed to mock him. It represented something lost, something that could never be recovered. He had promised himself that he would continue to honor Daniel's memory, but the bitterness of being overlooked by the country he had served for so long was too much to bear. It wasn't just the loss of his son that haunted Bob. It was the way his generation of veterans, his brothers and sisters in arms, had been forgotten. He had seen it happen time and time again. They came home from the wars, the ones who made it back, but they were ignored, forgotten by politicians, by the media, by the very people they had risked their lives to protect. The promises made to veterans like him and Daniel had evaporated into the ether, buried under the weight of bureaucracy and red tape. No one cared. No one remembered. But Bob wasn't the type to ask for recognition. He had never sought the spotlight. He didn't need a parade or a monument. But Memorial Day? Memorial Day was his day to mourn. To honor. To remember. It was a private moment for a private grief. And yet, today, as he stood at his son's grave, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just the loss of Daniel, it was the betrayal of everything he had fought for, everything his son had fought for. "Get your hands off me," he muttered again, the words more for himself than the contractors who dared to approach him. This was his battle now. Not one of bombs and bullets, but of memory, of honor. And he wasn't about to let anyone steal that from him. It wasn't just the grief that weighed on Bob Weston, it was the growing sense of injustice that gnawed at him from the inside. He had always carried a silent, simmering anger, one that he had learned to suppress over the years, to bury deep beneath his soldier's stoicism. But after Daniel's death, that anger had festered, spreading like a disease through his soul. It wasn't just personal, this wasn't just about losing his son. No, it ran deeper. It was about the system. The broken promises, the silent abandonment of those who had sacrificed everything, who had given up parts of themselves in wars that seemed to have no end. Bob had watched, helpless and bitter, as his generation of veterans, men like him, men who had bled for their country, were forgotten. They returned from the wars only to be discarded, left to fight for their benefits, left to fall into the cracks of a society that seemed too busy to care. The political promises made during campaign speeches were empty, designed to win votes but not to deliver results. The Veterans Affairs Office had become a labyrinth of bureaucracy and red tape, where men and women waited for years to receive the care and recognition they deserved. He had lived through it, watched it unfold, and for the longest time, he had kept his mouth shut. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the applause. But then, he watched Daniel, his own son, go through the same motions. When Daniel enlisted, it had been a promise of something better. A promise that if he served, if he fought, if he gave his life, the country would care for him. That promise had been a lie. The flag that Bob clutched in his hands wasn't just a symbol of pride. It was a symbol of failure. It was the last tangible thing left of Daniel, folded neatly, with precision, but hollow. A decoration meant to honor a soldier's sacrifice. But in Bob's heart, it felt like an empty gesture, a feeble acknowledgement that could never fill the void left by the loss of a son. And now, here he stood, at his son's grave, with security contractors telling him to move. It was a slap in the face. His anger, long suppressed, bubbled to the surface like a violent eruption. These men had no idea what he had given. They didn't know what it meant to lose a child. They didn't know what it meant to sacrifice everything. Their presence, their instructions to move, their lack of respect, Bob couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't just an injustice against him. This was an injustice against every soldier, every veteran, every person who had ever worn the uniform and fought for a country that had forgotten them. This wasn't just about his son's grave. This was about the betrayal of every promise that had been made. And today, standing in front of Daniel's tombstone, Bob felt that betrayal like a weight on his chest. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He could feel the bitterness rising within him. He had tried to keep it contained, tried to be patient, to be the stoic, to be the quiet veteran who didn't demand attention. But today, Memorial Day, the one day he had to honor those who had sacrificed, it was too much. He had come to this cemetery every year, faithfully, to pay his respects. But this year was different. This year, the disrespect he had silently tolerated for decades had reached its breaking point. Today wasn't just about his son's memory, it was about every veteran who had been left behind, every man and woman who had given their all for this country, only to be discarded like broken tools once their usefulness was over. In the stillness of Section 60, as the wind whispered through the rows of gravestones, Bob could feel the weight of the injustice pressing on him from all sides. The anger he had buried for so long was finally finding its voice. He had to stand up. He couldn't let this moment pass without making a stand. A soft rustling interrupted his thoughts. He turned slightly, and there, standing in the distance, was a figure watching him. A woman, dressed in navy blues, her uniform sharp and clean, standing alone. Bob didn't know her, but she had an air of quiet strength about her, as though she understood. She wasn't just an observer, she was a witness to something much larger than the small moment playing out before them. For a moment, Bob looked at her, wondering if she could sense the storm that was brewing inside him. He was a man on the edge, his emotions teetering between sorrow and rage, torn between honoring his son's memory and fighting for a future where others didn't suffer the same fate. He had given everything, his youth, his body, his family, and all he had gotten in return was silence, neglect, and now, this. The anger in Bob's chest was a fire that refused to be contained any longer. He had fought for his country, for the men and women who wore the uniform beside him. And now, in the face of his son's grave, he realized that it was no longer about just remembering the fallen. It was about fighting for what they had earned, respect, dignity, and a nation that didn't turn its back when the wars were over. Bob Weston wasn't just mourning today. He was declaring war on the indifference that had swallowed the soul of his country. Among the scattered crowd in Section 60, a figure stood silently observing the unfolding scene. She was dressed in the crisp, impeccable uniform of the Navy, her rank insignia gleaming with quiet pride. Navy Lieutenant Commander Michelle Rivers had been attending the Memorial Day ceremony with a group of other veterans, but her attention had drifted towards Bob Weston. She had seen him before, though not in person. She had read about him, heard stories whispered among veteran circles. His name carried weight. Sergeant Major Bob Weston, a man of honor, of duty, and now, by tragic circumstance, a Gold Star father. Michelle watched as the confrontation between Bob and the security contractors escalated. She had seen men in uniform bristle with anger before, but there was something different about this one. There was a rawness, an intensity in Bob's movements, in his eyes. The man was a veteran who had seen far too much, lost far too much. The weight of his grief was so palpable it was almost suffocating. But it wasn't just grief that Michelle saw in him. It was defiance. He wasn't just mourning today, he was standing up, calling out the injustice, refusing to be ignored. When Bob's voice cracked with the command to the contractors, Michelle felt a deep stirring in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was respect, or something else, perhaps a sense of shared pain, or the recognition of a battle she had not yet fought. But she knew, in that moment, that she had to do something. She had to stand with him. She had seen too many men like Bob Weston, silent, suffering, proud, and too many who had become invisible in their own country. She couldn't let him bear the brunt of this alone. She approached cautiously, her footsteps deliberate, trying not to intrude too suddenly. Bob was standing there, holding the flag with trembling hands, a single white rose clutched in his other hand. The grave before him was fresh, the ink of his son's name barely dry. Bob's back was stiff, his broad shoulders slumped slightly under the burden of years that had etched deep lines into his face. His eyes were fixed on the stone, unblinking, and Michelle knew he was fighting a battle of his own in that moment. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of service. "Are you okay?" Bob didn't respond at first. His eyes were still locked on the gravestone, his expression unreadable. Then, with a groan of effort, he slowly lifted his gaze, meeting hers. His features were strained, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as though he was seeing a kindred spirit for the first time in a long while. The lines of his face softened just the slightest bit as he looked at her, but only for a second. Then, his gaze returned to the grave, and Michelle knew that whatever battle raged inside him, it wasn't one she could help him fight. She could only stand beside him. Bob didn't speak at first. He was too exhausted, too defeated, and yet, he had an unyielding resolve. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unsaid words. But Michelle didn't need him to speak. She could hear it in the silence, the years of grief, the anger, the betrayal. She knelt beside him slowly, not out of pity, but out of respect, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Bob flinched, then let out a low, pained grunt as he pushed himself to his feet. He wasn't going to let her see him like this. He wasn't going to let anyone see him weak, not even a fellow service member. But the effort was too much for him. His legs buckled slightly as he stood, and blood, still fresh from a scuffle with the contractors, began to drip from his lip, staining his already weathered face. He was battered, but the flag never left his hands. Bob managed a weak, almost imperceptible nod in her direction, acknowledging her presence but saying nothing. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the rows of gravestones. Behind them, a shadow moved. A tall figure in a suit, walking with purpose, suddenly appeared at the edge of the cemetery. It was Congressman Gregory Matthews, a former Marine turned politician, who had been making the rounds with foreign dignitaries. He had arrived just in time to witness the tense scene unraveling before him. His eyes locked onto the contractors, his face hardening as he observed the chaos. "What happened here?" Matthews barked, striding forward, his expression tight. His voice, at first an edge of annoyance, carried a deep undercurrent of concern. He could sense the rising tension, the potential for the situation to spiral. He glanced at Bob briefly, then turned his attention to the security contractors, his jaw clenched in frustration. The contractors, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in authority, stammered under Matthews' gaze. We told him to move," one of them mumbled, barely able to meet the congressman's eyes. "The area's restricted." Matthews' face hardened further as he approached them, his eyes cold. "He's a Gold Star father. You don't touch him." The words were not just an order, but a command. There was no room for debate. No hesitation. You don't ever disrespect someone like that. You salute him. You respect him. The contractors stood there, frozen. They didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the crowd that had begun to gather took a collective step forward, drawn by the heat of the moment. A Marine captain, standing at the edge of the crowd, raised his hand tentatively. "Permission to assist you, Sergeant Major," the captain asked, his voice filled with quiet respect. Bob turned to him slowly, shaking his head with a finality that brooked no argument. "No," Bob replied, each word steeped in the weight of countless battles, both won and lost. "I walked into war. I'll walk out of this." His voice was low, yet firm, a declaration of independence, of a man who would never be controlled again. With immense effort, Bob straightened, his legs trembling under him, and took a step forward. He turned back to the contractors, his gaze piercing them with a look that held years of unspoken history. And then, with painstaking slowness, Bob knelt again before his son's grave. The white rose was placed gently at the base of the stone, and the flag was adjusted with trembling hands. It was a sacred moment, private, intimate, and it belonged only to him and to his son. The air was thick with silence. The crowd behind him, which had once been chaotic and uncertain, now stood still, waiting. Watching. Respecting. Bob's whispered words, though inaudible to anyone else, spoke volumes, words only his son could hear. The crowd's tension broke when Congressman Gregory Matthews strode forward, his face set in a mask of quiet fury. His presence was immediate, and his sharp gaze settled on the contractors first, his voice a low but powerful command. "What happened here?" Matthews asked, his words sharp and precise. The contractors fumbled in their response, stammering as they realized the gravity of their mistake. We told him to move. The area's restricted." Matthews' eyes narrowed. "He's a Gold Star father. You don't touch him." His tone was unequivocal, and it was as if the very air had shifted. Those standing around began to sense the growing authority in Matthews' voice. This wasn't just a question of protocol, it was a matter of respect, and Matthews wasn't about to let anyone forget it. He turned to the crowd that had gathered, speaking now with deliberate force. "This is a man who served. Who lost a son in combat. And no one, has the right to tell him where he can or cannot stand." His voice was gaining momentum, and those around him stood straighter, as if they too were absorbing the weight of the moment. "You salute him. You respect him." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The silence was palpable, and then, slowly, a shift occurred. The veterans in the crowd, those who had been standing silently in the background, began to make their way forward. It wasn't loud, or dramatic, but their movements were deliberate. Bob had fought beside men like them, men who understood the sanctity of the moment, the honor of standing beside a fellow soldier. From the back of the crowd, a Marine captain stepped forward, his uniform sharp and clean, his bearing proud but respectful. He stood a few paces away from Bob, offering a formal salute. "Permission to assist you, Sergeant Major," the captain asked, his voice calm but filled with a deep respect for the man before him. Bob looked at him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But then, slowly, Bob shook his head. "No," Bob's voice was firm, rooted in years of experience. "I walked into war. I'll walk out of this." There was no anger in his words, no defiance, just the quiet finality of someone who had seen and done things others couldn't begin to understand. The captain didn't press him further. He simply nodded in recognition, stepping back into the crowd. Bob, still holding the flag, slowly lifted it to adjust it once again. His hands were steady, despite the years of grief and the weariness that had settled in his bones. He knelt once more, carefully placing the white rose at the base of his son's gravestone. His actions were deliberate, thoughtful. Each movement was filled with a kind of reverence. This was his son, this was his duty. He would not let it be tarnished by disrespect. The contractors, now standing quietly at the edges of the scene, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. They stood still, their eyes averted, unsure of how to proceed. Bob's stance, his unwavering dedication to his son, had transformed the moment. This was no longer just about a confrontation, it was about the respect that had been demanded and earned through years of sacrifice. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted again. A Marine, standing at attention in the crowd, slowly raised his hand in salute. His movement was deliberate, but it was not alone. One by one, the veterans in the crowd began to follow suit. First a few, then a dozen, then a larger group. Salutes echoed through the cemetery, each one more powerful than the last. The sound was soft but resolute, a silent show of solidarity, of respect. It wasn't anger or rage that the crowd felt, it was reverence. The applause came softly at first, one hesitant clap. Then another. Slowly, the applause built in volume, until it was a rolling wave of recognition that spread across Section 60. The sound of it filled the air, a steady rhythm that resonated through the graves, through the memories, through the hearts of those who had given so much. Bob stood, his legs unsteady, but his spirit unwavering. The applause wasn't for him, it was for what he represented. For every soldier, every sacrifice, every promise broken by the very people they had sworn to protect. It wasn't about the individual. It was about honoring something much larger, honoring a commitment, a duty, and a legacy. As Bob limped slowly through the crowd, the applause intensified. A standing ovation, not for a hero in the conventional sense, but for a man who had lived through battles, through loss, through decades of forgotten promises. Bob's eyes stayed focused straight ahead. He didn't look around at the crowd. He didn't need to. The respect was palpable, and that was enough. He whispered under his breath, the words almost lost in the rising claps, he'd be proud. The sound of applause carried on for what felt like eternity, but eventually, it began to fade, leaving behind an echo that lingered in the cool air. Bob had given everything to his country. His son had given everything, and today, at long last, they had been recognized. The moment was more than just a symbol of personal grief. It was a statement that resonated across the nation. Bob Weston had reminded everyone what true sacrifice looked like, and that it would not, could not, be forgotten. 7 minutes passed since the confrontation, and in that time, the world had shifted. The quiet hum of Arlington National Cemetery had been replaced by a hum of solidarity, a ripple of quiet recognition that spread like wildfire through the hallowed grounds. Veterans from every era, every conflict, began to appear, each one silently stepping forward, drawn to the reverberations of the moment. They came from the edges of the cemetery, from behind the gravestones, from corners of the world where their names would never be remembered. But they were here now, their footsteps falling in sync with the echo of Bob Weston's stand. They came alone or in small groups, their uniforms, both old and new, an unmistakable mark of the battles they had fought, both external and internal. The air had become thick with something far stronger than just respect, it was solidarity. A united front for those who had been left behind by the very nation they had sacrificed for. No one spoke. Not a word was uttered. Some veterans stood at attention, while others took a knee, the simple act of sitting a quiet act of defiance and dignity. Some held up candles, their flames flickering in the still air, a small but powerful tribute to the ones who had fallen, men and women whose names were etched in the stones of Arlington, forgotten by time but not by those who had shared the same burden. The contractors who had once tried to move Bob away, now watching from the sidelines, were surrounded by this silent army. They were no longer in control of the situation, no longer the enforcers of some ill-conceived rule. They had become mere spectators, uncertain in the face of something they couldn't understand. Bob stood amidst it all, the center of the quiet storm that had engulfed the cemetery. His breath was shallow, his body trembling slightly from the effort, but his resolve remained unshaken. His gaze was locked on his son's gravestone, on the name that had taken everything from him. He had come to this place every year for Memorial Day, and every year, it had felt like a solitary act of defiance. But this year, for the first time, Bob wasn't alone. He was never alone. Bob's hand, still clutching the flag, hovered in the air for a long moment before he saluted his son's grave. It was slow, deliberate. A soldier's salute, a final, respectful gesture to a man who had given everything for the same country that had taken him away. His hand stayed in the air longer than most would expect, and in that time, the world seemed to stand still. The wind, which had been quiet, picked up, rustling through the trees like the soft murmur of approval. After a long pause, Bob lowered his hand and began to slowly limp away from his son's grave. His legs were unsteady, but the weight of years of loss didn't weigh him down. He had been through far worse. He had walked through far worse. As Bob moved, the crowd of veterans fell into step behind him, one by one, like an unspoken procession. They didn't need words. They didn't need direction. They understood. They had all fought the same fight, had all sacrificed in their own ways. And for the first time in a long time, they stood together, not just as veterans but as a collective force, silently acknowledging the debt that they had all paid and yet still owed. The silence was profound, and the air was thick with the presence of so many lost souls. Bob didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew they were there, each one of them walking with him, their presence a testament to what had been lost. The power of their silence was louder than any word could have been. It was a declaration, not of anger, but of honor, a quiet, unyielding strength that couldn't be ignored. As Bob neared the cemetery gates, a single clap rang out. It was soft at first, hesitant, unsure. But then another followed. Then another. And then the sound of applause grew louder, more insistent. It was slow at first, the applause hesitant and almost reverent, but then it gained strength, growing into a tide of sound that reverberated through the cemetery. The veterans who had gathered, the strangers, the dignitaries who had been watching from the sidelines, they all stood and clapped. The sound was steady now, a rhythmic beat of recognition, of respect, and of shared loss. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't an expression of anger. It was an act of reverence. Bob's steps slowed as the applause continued to grow. He stopped, but only for a moment, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His body felt worn, but his spirit remained as unbroken as ever. As the sound of clapping grew, he stood taller, more resolute, like the very weight of the applause was lifting him. He turned slightly, taking in the faces in the crowd, the faces of those who had stood by him in this moment. His throat tightened as the emotion, long buried beneath layers of stoicism, began to surface. But he fought it back. He had been through too much to give in now. Instead, he whispered, almost to himself, he'd be proud. Bob turned away and walked through the gates, the sound of applause following him like a wave, echoing through the cemetery, through the years of grief, through the generations of soldiers who had given all they had and asked for nothing in return. The applause didn't stop until Bob had passed out of view, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. The silence, once broken, began to return. But it wasn't the same silence that had existed before. This silence was charged with something different, something that carried the weight of a collective memory, a collective sacrifice, a collective promise that would never be forgotten again. Bob Weston had reminded them all of something essential. The sacrifice of soldiers, of fathers, of mothers, of sons and daughters who had given everything. And that memory, that debt, would echo through the generations. Enduring legacy.